My name is Nils Rickardsson. I'm a research fellow in clinical psychology and a clinical psychologist in the stroke service. I'm based at the University of Strathclyde and in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. I will talk a little bit about the research study we conducted looking into something called psychological flexibility and its role in the well-being and distress amongst people who provide care for someone with an acquired brain injury. I'm part of a research network called Anchor Point, which is made up by clinicians and researchers, so please follow us on social media to find more presentations and information about our work. Before I start, I just wanted to do some acknowledgements as well, because this research study was not just made by myself, but also David Gillanders at the University of Edinburgh, Jan Scotland, and Blanca Poveda at NHS Lothian as well. And also thank you to all the participants who took part in the study. It wouldn't be possible without all of you. The study was made during my doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Edinburgh and was supported by NHS Lothian for recruitment. This is the reference to the study itself. Okay, so and it was published in the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science, where you will find the full study. So why did we want to conduct a study looking at distress and well-being in caregivers of people with acquired brain injury? Well, it's well established that this group report higher prevalence of psychological stress and a worse well-being when we compare to the general population, but also caregivers of other conditions such as dementia or psychosis as well, according to the references here on the slide. We also know that there is a link between how the caregiver is doing and the neuropsychological recovery of the person with the brain injury. So it's a key thing that we need to think more about and learn more about in order to not just help the caregiver, but also to improve rehabilitation for people with brain injury. We also know that there are a group that are vulnerable to stressors from kind of more systemic point of views. And I guess one big one recently have been COVID. So what did we already know? We knew that not everyone reports distress or reduced well-being. Caregiving in many cases can be associated with positive outcomes, and many caregivers report that this part of their personal growth and that they have got closer to the person and in the long term have developed new skills and really benefited the well-being in the long term. However, we also know that some people report distress and difficulties. In terms of the theory, one big model to understand and predict outcomes in this group has been a stress process model, the SPM. It's been established for quite some time and has identified a few key predictors. So functional disability of the person with the brain injury, in terms of how that's perceived and rated by the caregiver, that's a predictor that we know has been linked to distress. How the caregiver appraise the situation, how if they have a kind of a catastrophic interpretation, or if the caregiver is how they perceive the role of being a caregiver, that's linked directly to their well-being. We also know that coping style and social support are key predictors, part of this stress process model. So that's also been the targets when we think about how to support this group. These factors are then understandably what's been targeted in interventions so far. So why psychological flexibility and what is it, first of all? So very briefly, for if there's anyone who's never heard about it, it's an ability in humans to live their life in an open, present and engaging way, and by that open up to all types of experiences, including challenging ones. So the ability to also be present in their experiences and be able to observe what is going on in that moment, and paying attention to how thoughts and emotions and difficult stuff impacts our behavior, and doing so whilst being aware and knowing what's important to us and how we can engage fully with that. So why psychological flexibility in ABI caregivers? Well, the research tells us that psychological flexibility is promising for long-term challenging context, and that includes chronic pain and other neurological conditions. So conditions where we don't necessarily think about a way of getting rid of that experience. We know that that's going to be a long-term challenging experience. The role of psychological flexibility and the intervention to practice psychological flexibility, called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy ACT, has good evidence for caregivers, and we know that psychological flexibility is important for caregivers as well, for caregivers of people with psychosis and dementia. And there's been some randomized controlled trials showing that ACT is helpful for people who care for someone with dementia. There's also qualitative data which tells us that acceptance and being able to live in the present moment is important to able to adjust to the role of being a caregiver. So that tells us that it's important to think about those concepts and how we can build those concepts and make them stronger. And one way to improve acceptance and to live in the present moment is acceptance and commitment therapy, where the aim is to practice and to improve psychological flexibility. So the aims and the questions with our study, the aim was to explore the role of psychological flexibility and how to understand better how this concept, if it's important or not in this specific population. So the specific questions we have were, does psychological flexibility significantly predict outcomes when we've controlled for the established factors, when we've accounted for them? And that's such as appraisal and coping style and social support. But also, do appraisals of the caregiving situation mediate the link between functional disability and the caregiver outcome? So if we know that functional disability is linked with caregiver outcomes, do the appraisals play a role in between there? Do they mediate that relationship as predicted by the stress process model? And is social support, coping, and psychological flexibility buffering that indirect effect of appraisals? We use a cross-sectional design and recruited online through brain injury charities and NHS. We looked at adult informal caregivers, and we recruited any type of acquired brain injury, whilst excluding degenerative conditions such as dementia, Parkinson's, and MS. We included important demographics such as the type of relationship to the care recipient, time spent caring, and if there were help from others. And we looked at depression and anxiety as primary outcomes, and we also looked at satisfaction with life as a primary outcome. The predictors that we wanted to investigate were psychological flexibility, and we used COMPACT as a measure to do this. It includes items such as I work hard to keep out upsetting feelings, and we also wanted to have a measure of functional disability of the care recipient, which we did by asking the caregiver to rate and to get their rating, their perceived functional disability of the care recipient. Negative appraisals, we also looked at coping and to see what type of coping style. So we used a questionnaire where we could measure if the person is more towards problem-focused coping, avoidant coping, or emotion-focused coping. And we also used a questionnaire to measure the person's social support. The way we wanted to analyze the data was to first rule out and to see what covariates, what demographics were important. We wanted to see what factors correlated and in what way in predicted theoretical directions. We then use hierarchical regression to be able to rule out and to see how and what factors are important when these established factors are already accounted for in model, and is psychological flexibility still an important factor when we included all the more established factors in the models. We then also wanted to look at more specifically how these factors interact with each other, and we did that by using conditional process analysis. First, a mediation model where we had functional disability and its relationship with an outcome such as depression and anxiety, and then wanted to see, is appraisal mediating that relationship? But then we also wanted to look at a moderated mediation model where, if that is a mediator appraisal, is there any factors moderating that mediation? So if appraisals are mediating the relationship between functional disability and outcome, if the person has a lot of social support or a specific coping style or higher level of psychological flexibility, is that a target? Is that something that if we change that, if that changed, the person can still have these appraisals, these negative or catastrophic appraisals, and still maintain a good quality of life? So we were able to recruit 145 caregivers. Most were female, spouses, and working. Most of them did not have access to professional care, and the mean age were just about around 50 years of age. We recruited, we were able to have a similar age for the care recipients, just below 50. In terms of covariates, for anxiety there were no significant ones. For depression, time spent caring reported by the caregiver was an important one, and help from others were also significantly correlating with depression. Satisfaction with life, we knew that the time spent caring was an important one, and it correlated with satisfaction with life. Age of the caregiver and age of the care recipient as well. In terms of correlations, the majority of predicted correlations that happened, and as they were hypothesized by the SPM model, or in terms of we hypothesized in terms of psychological flexibility. We found moderate to strong correlations. There were some exceptions. Problem-focused coping didn't correlate with anxiety, depression, and emotion-focused coping styles did not correlate with anxiety. In terms of our hierarchical regression, we did, so what you see here is for each of the outcomes, anxiety, depression, and satisfaction with life, this is the final model, and the bold ones are the significant predictors. So for anxiety, the disability rated by the caregiver is a predictor, avoidant coping, and psychological flexibility. In terms of depression, avoidant coping again, and psychological flexibility. And for satisfaction with life, time caring as a covariate, and age, functional disability, the appraisal, and problem-focused coping, but not psychological flexibility, as we had predicted. Or we predicted that psychological flexibility would be predicted, but wasn't. You also have the final models down below as well. So in terms of the process analysis, we did find that appraisals mediated the relation between functional disability and outcomes. And interestingly, for depression, the mediation was so strong that it can cancel out the direct relationship between functional disability and depression. So we can see that this relationship here was cancelled out. You can see here that it's still significant even when appraisals are in the model, and the same with satisfaction with life. However, this relationship between functional disability and depression were no longer significant when we included appraisals. In terms of the moderated mediation models, only 2 models found a significant moderator of that relationship, the indirect relationship of appraisals between functional disability and outcome. So the one we found first was for depression. We found a psychological flexibility moderated the mediation of appraisal. So we can see here in these small boxes here that low psychological flexibility strengthen. We can see that there is a less, when someone has a high psychological flexibility, this relationship is no longer significant, and we can see there is a significant moderation. So when someone has strong appraisals, if they also have a psychological flexibility, then these strong appraisals are less important. Interestingly enough, we also found that problem-focused coping had the opposite effect on well-being. So people with problem-focused coping, that actually strengthened the mediation of appraisal. So a problem-focused approach didn't seem helpful. It actually strengthened the importance of how we interpret the situation as a caregiver. So what all this means is that psychological flexibility seems to be important for anxiety and depression amongst this group of caregivers that we recruited. It was the strongest predictor compared to established constructs for anxiety and depression. It also, psychological flexibility also had a buffering effects on negative cognitions about the caregiver context. So even if someone has higher negative cognitions, if they're able to be present and take a step away from those cognitions, they can still have them and still report a high well-being. These cognitions, the appraisals, predicted satisfaction of life and mediated the link between functional disability of the person with a brain injury and outcomes as expected by the stress process model. Avoidant coping was also an important factor and explained a high proportion of anxiety and depression in this group. No significant difference on outcomes between caregivers of different acquired brain injuries. So we recruited people who cared for someone with infectious diseases, hypoxic brain injury, stroke, traumatic brain injury. We didn't find a difference between those groups in terms of anxiety, depression, and well-being of the caregiver. And the amount of time spent caring was also very important for how the person was coping, which is an important thing to take away. So in terms of what we can then think about moving forward with what we learned from this study is that acceptance and commitment therapy-based interventions or traditional cognitive behavioral therapy could be helpful. Acceptance and commitment therapy could be more focused on distress and anxiety from these findings, and to help to foster that open, aware, and engaged ability to live a life full of things that are important and valued to the person, whilst being able and willing to experience the range of difficult emotions and the difficult thoughts that are part of being a caregiver. Cognitive behavioral therapy could probably be a good alternative to target specific appraisals, so how we think about the caregiver situation, especially for satisfaction of life. However, this is only a cross-sectional studies, and I think limitations are really important to highlight as well. It's a self-selected cross-sectional sample, and the self-report measures have their limitations. I think a next step would be to look at longitudinal designs. Would be really interesting with a group of caregivers, see over time how these things changes, or with a bigger sample to be able to do more specific analysis using structural equation modeling. But also I think intervention studies will have their place, so randomized controlled trials or smaller end studies will probably be really interesting to move into, as we now know that psychological flexibility play an important role in this group. So again, thanks for taking the time to listen to this, and again, if you want more information about Anchor Point, please get in touch or follow us through social media. Thank you very much.